more perspective now on the summit and the situation in Ukraine. Eugene Chausovsky joins us now live via Skype. He's a geopolitical analyst at Johns Hopkins University. Welcome back to the show. Good to see you. What's on the agenda here for this conference in France? We know about the problems. We know about what the needs are. The timing is interesting, but it seems to be gaining more and more momentum as some people, I guess, are hopeful that this conflict will come to an end soon.
Right. So this conference will be about setting the agenda both for the short term and long term in terms of reconstruction in Ukraine and providing much needed financial support. Obviously, in the immediate term, Ukraine has faced a lot of issues over its energy infrastructure, which has been severely degraded by Russia, but also it will need to have much of its infrastructure in the broader country repaired and renovated for the medium to long term. So this is about shoring up that Western financial support and really across all of Ukraine's backers and allies.
Ukraine, prior to the conflict, has always been a very key manufacturing hub for Europe, from cars to wires to all things that go into many things that you and I use on a day-to-day basis, and that's been greatly disrupted. What percentage of disruption do you think has impacted the private sector in Ukraine? Because there are parts that are somewhat normal, but many parts that aren't.
Well, it's difficult to say at this point, especially as the conflict goes on and we can't really anticipate how much more damage there will be. But I know that Zelensky has said recently that as much as 50% of Ukraine's energy infrastructure has been either damaged or completely destroyed. And obviously energy fuels the rest of the economy. So clearly there's a lot of work to do to be reconstructed. But first and foremost, there needs to be some kind of end to the conflict, or at least an idea of how it's going to play out. And that's when Ukraine can really focus on rebuilding its economy with the help from these countries at the donor conference.
Do you think there's a sense, and this is, we've had a number of these conversations, but is there a sense that as we get to the end of 2022, that there is some sort of guarded optimism that we are nearing the end of the conflict? And I say that very tenuously because it's on a lot of hope, really, because Russia has not said anything that this conflict would end anytime soon.
Right, and even Russian President Putin has said that he anticipates that the conflict could be, well beyond the short term moving forward. But we have seen some signs of progress. There was the recent prisoner swap, very high-profile prisoner swap between Russia and the U.S. Even the Black Sea grain deal, which faced some challenges, but was eventually extended for a period of several months. This goes to show that there is room still for diplomacy to help alleviate, if not end, the Ukrainian conflict. But in terms of actually, completely resolving it, I don't expect that in the near term. And that's why, in the meantime, Ukraine is looking for that much needed assistance, not only militarily, but also economically from its partners.
I mean, at this point, if there was a ceasefire or a more permanent solution, there would still be skepticism. And you're talking about the hundreds of billions of dollars that are needed just to repair the basic infrastructure, not even support the private businesses that have been disrupted there. And I think that skepticism is going to lead to some folks to say, do you put money in immediately, or do you hold back little by little, or do you play it by ear? Because this is going to take a very, very long time to rebuild this. How are these international organizations going to manage this? Because it's not a short-term issue.
That's true, and there's even been some parallels to this being equivalent to a German, Marshall Plan, essentially, for Ukraine. So there are those bigger issues that you mentioned, but there is room for some things in the interim. We've even seen some investments, albeit in a small scale, for things like agricultural production from companies like Nestle. Ukraine does have a very large and relatively well-educated workforce in areas like IT. So there are things that can be happening in the medium term, but in terms of that full-scale rebuild, yes, it's going to be a matter of years, if not decades, and that assumes that the conflict will end at some point in the not-too-distant future.
How will the costs be shared? So let's just take the beginning of energy, internet, roads, bridges, some of the basic infrastructure things that we see on television and hear about. How are those costs and rebuilding going to be shared among not just those countries, but other countries that we haven't even mentioned yet?
Well, I think this is what's going to be determined, over the next couple of months, because they're still in the process of assessing that damage. And I think this is going to be just because of the sheer size of the funds needed. It's going to have to be shared by a number of different countries, from the public sector to the private sector. And this is why we are seeing the G7 get involved, the EU, the US, obviously. So this isn't any kind of thing that, one country can share or can take on its own. And so the Ukraine will need as much help as it can from as many different partners as it can get.
What do you think the timeline is? What's a reasonable expectation if you've got investments or had investments in Ukraine, or for those still in Ukraine and they're expecting assistance? What is a reasonable time frame for step 1, 2, and 3?
Well, I think that the time frame just for the announcement will probably be sometime early next year, when we're starting to see this fund set up, and the channels. They're making sure that they're doing this diligently to make sure that there's, issues with corruption and siphoning off of funds is addressed. So that's step 1 of this. And I think they're going to take it step by step, addressing the most critical issues like energy, for example. That I think will happen within the first few months. But in terms of rebuilding broader infrastructure, like I said, this is going to be a years-long, if not decades-long, issue.
Right, and I want to follow up with one point here that you brought up, which is really accountability, right? So the EU may possibly have a role, the IMF possibly, the World Bank possibly. There are other NGOs out there that could take the lead on it, but ultimately, who's going to hold those accountable that the money and dollars are flowing to the places that need it most in a secure fashion?
Well, I think that Ukraine will be working with all of its partners. It's well aware of the stakes here, and that this is an issue that needs to be handled in a transparent fashion. The Zelensky government really depends on the U.S., the EU, and even these multilateral institutions that you mentioned. So I think this is going to be a difficult challenge, but one that I think will be pursued with care by the government and by its Western partners.
Yeah, Eugene Chausovsky, thank you very much. Really appreciate the insight. This has been a tough story to cover throughout the year. We all hope that the fighting and the killing and the bombing stop soon. Thank you.